In this video, we are going to investigate and demonstrate adding modularity to an existing program. Remember when we use modules or methods, uh, which is a module, we are always going to follow this template. You're going to have public static. Inside the angle brackets is a return type. That is something you will need to fill in. You will need to fill in the method name. And inside parentheses, you will need to fill in the parameter list. So in this example, anything inside the angle brackets are items that you need to complete. We already have an example in this code of a method that we used previously to print an array. So we have the public static, void is our return type, print array is the name of the method, and our parameter includes an integer array. And so we've seen in action this particular method. What we want to do, though, is study our code and see if there's any way to refactor our code to make it easier to read and then also maybe easier to edit later on. So I always kind of try to think of when I'm thinking of modularity, I try to think of our IPO model. I try to think of our input, our processing, and our output. And if possible, we want to maybe create some modules for those as we create our programs. So whenever we run our code, if I actually run this code right now, it prints some numbers. I will tell you that I don't think this is a very good output screen because it's not very user friendly. It doesn't tell the user what we're doing. And so it's not very good. It was decent when we were demonstrating just a little task. But if we actually want to make this user friendly, we want to have basically, we should always have some type of an intro message in our code. We should, if necessary, we might have to have input from the user. We want to do the processing, which is next. And then we also want to have some type of an end message. So I am thinking that we want to make modules for our intro message. We want to make a module for our processing, which is filling the array. We have printing the array already done, and then we're going to have an end message. I've gone ahead and created a couple of the methods for the print introduction and the end method. So first of all, when we call a method, we use the method name to call the method. So I created a method called print introduction. It doesn't return anything, so it's a void method, and it has no parameters. And its only job is to output. If I were to execute this code, you're going to see that it outputs. The code will produce random numbers. So now our code is more user-friendly. And then the end message is just a processing is done. Have a nice day. You might be asking, well, why do you do that just for a single print statement? And the reason is I'm separating out different or compartmentalizing different segments of my code, such as the IPO and the input, processing, and output. The other thing is, even though this is just a simple message, this might actually be a full routine or a whole set of instructions. Like maybe my method was print instructions, and there's a whole lot of options on the instructions. Like you could have variations and you could have different, if they chose this on the instructions or do the following, like it could be its own little monster, so to speak. And so if I can have a single method to do all of that processing, then it makes it easier in my main method to just say, okay, print introductions is going to get done, and then somebody else is going to handle it. In this example, neither of these methods, print introduction nor end message, have a parameter. In order to make my code a little bit more user-friendly, it might be nice to tell them how many random numbers we are going to produce. The value that gets passed in is actually called an argument. It's going to yell at me because it's noticing that now my method call does not match my method header. This first line of the method is called the method header. So I have to say I'm going to bring in the amount of integers that we are going to print. Try to make this variable descriptive. You can name it exactly the same if you want. If I do size, because I'm not making it a constant, I might use lowercase. So amount or size would be fine. But now I'm going to say code will produce, and I want it to say my 6 random numbers. So I need to close off the quotes. I need to add the variable. I need to add and then open my quotes. So now it will say that I'm going to produce 6 random numbers, which is even more user friendly. So that shows how to send one value to the method and it doesn't return anything. The end message prints one thing, doesn't return anything. So those are two different methods. I've now compartmentalized that part of my code. I'm going to close up those methods so I can have more space on my screen. So now we're going to pull the processing out and put that into a method. So first of all, I want to think about an appropriate name. What is this particular segment of code doing? Is it's filling my array. When I create my method, remember I always have to think public static. What's the return type going to be? What is the method name? And what is my parameter list? So there's two different ways that I can think about this. I can start it down here when I do my method header. So public static, and now it's got to return a value. What is it going to return? Well, it's going to return my array filled with numbers, and that return value is an integer array. So we use int bracket to indicate that it's an integer array that's being returned. The name of my method, I already said I want to call my method fill array. And then I'm going to need, a whole bunch of things. Like, what am I going to need in my parameter list to fill my array? I don't know. So I've got part of my method stubbed out. Now I'm going to go back and look at, what is it that I need? So I'm going to actually kind of think about, okay, I need to assign lottery nums the value that's returned from the array. So lottery nums is going to be assigned the value returned from the method. I said returned from the array, but I meant returned from the method. And I should say it's going to be assigned the array returned from the method because the method's going to return an array. So when I call the method, this method's going to return an array. That array is going to get stored into lottery nums. So that's what my thinking is. How do I do that? Is I call the method. The method is fill array, but I need to send it all of my information. So first of all, I need to send it the array I'm working with, lottery nums. I need to send it my min value. I need to send it my max value. I don't have to send it my size, but I do need to send it my my random number generating object. All of those things are going to be sent to the array. The array is going to return a value, and it's going to be stored locally into lottery nums. So now I need to create my parameter list within my array, and it has to match in terms of data types. So lottery nums is an integer array, so I have to use int bracket. I'm going to use just the name nums locally here. I'm going to bring in an integer for the min. Notice I'm not making it constant. I could, but I'm not going to in this case, just to save some space. And I'm going to bring in max. Those are two different variables. And random is actually of type, rand is of type random, and I'm going to leave it named exactly the same. It's going to be important to realize that even if I name it the same, it's a different object within memory. Like the computer doesn't recognize any of these particular names outside of this method. We call that the scope of those variables. So as soon as this method is done, then all of those variables go out of scope and they no longer exist or not available to us. Whenever you are creating a method, especially if it returns a value, you're going to get an error. I'm working in the Eclipse environment. But whatever environment you're in, it might tell you that you have an error because the method doesn't return a value. So we know that it has to return an integer array. We know that we are going to be using this nums array locally to fill it with random numbers. So I'm going to go ahead and put return nums right now. And that takes care of that error message. We might have to, change this later because, depending on what we return, it might actually change. But this gets us what we call a method stub. So I could actually run my program. It's not going to do anything right now, but I could run the program and do some debugging if I wanted to. That allows me maybe to fix some of my other methods if they have a mistake in them, or whatever, while I'm, before I'm actually done writing this method. This particular method, we are going to borrow the code that we used for our processing. We are going to make some changes to it. Instead of lottery nums, I now need to use the local variable nums. And so I change any reference to lottery nums to nums because I'm now working outside of that main. Instead of max capital, I'm going to use max lowercase. And instead of min capital, I'm going to use min lowercase because I changed those names. I kept the same name random, so I didn't need to change that. When this particular array gets done, then it should return nums. This processing step here is going to get removed because it's going to get replaced with this method call, fill array, lottery num min max rand. So now if I look at my main driver, I have my IPO model is kind of being followed. I have a little introduction, even though it's not input, but it is a little introduction. I have processing, and then I have a couple of output situations. Depending on how much you like to comment your code, I kind of like to make my code self-documenting, which means the name of the variables, the name of the methods are telling me what it does, so I don't actually need to use a lot of comments. We're going to execute this code and see what happens, and we have an error message right where it said we had an error, and I don't know why, so I have to take a look at, oh, I now know why. I didn't close off my for loop. I didn't do my end for, which is a curly brace. So this was the beginning curly brace, and I had copied that in, so I missed my ending curly brace. So now I should be able to execute this. And it executes just like it did before, but now everything is modularized. A few last comments before we're done with this example. So after I kind of moved some code around and deleted some lines, and I'm going to delete this comment too, you can see that all of our mainline logic here is now been modularized. So I basically have 4 lines of code here that take care of my program. I could move these constants to inside my fill array method. I didn't because I wanted to show you how to send all of these values, multiple values, into a method and work with them. Also, the other reason for not moving them into the method would be that I might want to use these values in main, which means between this curly brace and the ending curly brace here. That's my main method. I might actually want to use them in main, and so if I move them all to my method, I would not have access to them outside of main. I know the video was a little bit long, but I hope you've hung in there because this provides an example of modularizing your code and breaking apart what we call the business logic from our user input and output. Our business logic is this processing here, and our input and output are all of the other pieces or modules. And it's a good practice in programming to separate your business logic from your inputs and outputs.